Hi everyone. So as we move into talking about memory, we're going to start off by talking about one of the most canonical or well-known models of memory, and that's something called the modal model of memory. And I'm going to give you a brief overview of this model in order to kind of explain one type of approach in cognitive science, and that's something called information processing. But at the same time, I'm going to give you a rough idea about this model that we're going to talk about, and then I'm going to go into more specifics. But basically with the modal model of memory, what this theory suggests is that we have some sort of incoming information. Okay, this might be a lecture, this might be some experience that's going on in your life. Basically, that information gets put into a very short-term thing called sensory memory that, don't worry, in a minute we'll go through exactly what this means. And then that information, if it's decided to be important, can be stored in something that, at least for the moment, we're going to call short-term memory. Now, a couple different things can happen in short-term memory. We can either rehearse things so they stay in short-term memory. So a good example of this is trying to remember somebody's phone number. We repeat that phone number over and over again to ourselves. That's what we're talking about whenever we talk about maintenance rehearsal. And a couple of different things can happen, right, based on our experience of that. One of the things that can happen is that we're able to keep that phone number in our short-term memory for a period of time until we can get to a phone and make the call. Or we could have a jerk friend or something like that decide to spit out a bunch of random numbers at it, and basically what happens is that information gets lost, as represented here in the model, where we just lose it. We lose our place and we have to go back and look at the sheet of paper to try and get the phone number. The other thing that can happen is that if we keep rehearsing it over and over again, it may eventually get placed into what we're going to refer to as long-term memory. And so this is a phone number that you have in long-term memory, and whenever you need it, you can, assuming that it's not lost in long-term memory, you can retrieve it in order to make that phone call. So maybe if you remember your childhood landline phone number or something like that, it's tucked away in your long-term memory. Whenever you try to recall it, you're able to retrieve that information, and it goes back into short-term memory while you tell a friend what your childhood phone number was, and then that information will be stored back in long-term memory. So it's a rough overview of the modal model of memory. And my purpose here is kind of twofold. One of the things I'm trying to do is to kind of get you comfortable with this model and walk you through some of the basics of it. But the other thing that I want to talk about, because this is a really good example of a basic idea, a kind of broad or general theory in cognitive science known as information processing theory. And information processing theory really kind of comes out of the early reliance on cognitive science in thinking of things like computers. And so in a lot of ways, whenever we're talking about information processing, especially if you have a computer science background, that connects a lot with the way early cognitive scientists were talking about information processing theory in trying to understand cognitive processes. And basically in this theory, what ends up happening is that it's usually represented as a series of boxes and arrows, much like we have in the modal model, where information, such as some broad cognitive process like memory, actually requires several sub-steps. And those sub-steps are determined by these boxes here. And as we see in modal memory, basically what happens is we have a pathway where we move from one thing happening, it gets processed in sensory memory, from sensory memory it then goes on to short-term memory. There are a couple different things that can happen in short-term memory, such as moving it into long-term memory or it being lost. And the idea here is that in this information processing theory, which again, if you see boxes and arrows, typically in information processing theory, but what it suggests is that in order for some big cognitive process like memory to occur, that there are a series of small discrete steps, and each of those discrete steps must be completed in order for it to move forward in some way. Now this should kind of ring somewhat of a bell for you, because this is also, when we were talking about serial processing, this is the same kind of basic idea that's going on. And in fact, most information processing theories are serial processing theories also, right? It's just serial processing is an idea about how it's represented in the brain, where informational processing is a theoretical viewpoint on how it's actually conducted based on kind of small subsets of cognitive processes. So I just wanted to introduce this idea to you, and modal model is kind of a nice, clean, clear way to get this idea across so that you're familiar. And if you do deal with cognitive psychology in any point later in your life, or even in your computer science classes, I want you to at least be aware of this idea, because it is kind of a big, overarching, important idea that happens in cognitive science and also computer science. But kind of putting that aside and focusing a little bit more on the modal model of memory, this was a model of memory. It was developed in 1968 by two researchers named Atkinson and Shiffrin. And basically, what they developed is that there was a process, the process that we just described, that explains how information gets stored into memory and also kind of breaks up separate individual parts of memory. And so one of the first stages that they argued for is something called sensory memory. And sensory memory is just very brief. And so when I'm saying very brief, I'm really talking like fractions of a second. So I'm going to give some examples here, but these examples are kind of rough examples, right? Because it actually elapses over a relatively long time. Whereas with sensory memory, it's a very, very short amount of time where basically there's some sort of an after image that's left in the sensory system. So sensory memory, really, really short, but there are two different ways that I kind of like to talk about this that make sense to students. And one of those is if you ever have kind of looked at something for a minute or two and you've closed your eyes and you can still see whatever that image is after you've closed your eyes, that kind of gets at the idea of sensory memory, right? That's just there for a small second and it stays there in your kind of sensory system, even though there's nothing actually directly stimulating your sensory system at that moment. Another good example is kind of light photography, right? So it's around 4th of July, we're playing with sparklers, and we move those sparklers around. One of the things that happens is that one of the things kids do quite a bit actually is write their names with the sparklers, right? And we can actually perceive like an A being written or something like that. Now, we don't actually see, right? Because the light's constantly moving, we don't actually see an A. But because of sensory memory, there's kind of this after image that exists that we can see to allow us to say, oh, what Billy just wrote is an A with his sparkler, or something like that. That's roughly what we're talking about whenever we're talking about sensory memory, where we're just talking about some sort of an after image that exists, even though that physical stimulus isn't present anymore. Now, just to introduce kind of a little terminology related to this, whenever we're talking about sensory memory, the two types that we're going to be focusing on as we talk about this are iconic sensory memory, which is basically anytime that we have any sort of a visual memory in the sensory memory system, or echoic, which is just auditory sensory memory, right? So we also have experiences where it's like we can hear the words that somebody just said, even though they're still not talking, right? You can still hear that word. So that's sensory memory. Now, we're going to talk about this terminology later and eventually switch to talking about working memory. But at least in the original modal model of memory, it was termed short-term memory. And basically the way that we can think of this is it's just basically a very brief storage of memory. In the case of short-term memory, we're just talking on the time scale of several seconds. And it just stays in that short-term memory store for a relatively small amount of time. So good examples of this are, let's say that you're trying to count money or change, and so you kind of have this information in mind, but again, we'll bring in our jerk friend who, as you're counting out dollar bills and trying to count the money, starts throwing just random numbers at you. And what ends up happening is that then that short-term memory gets interrupted and you're no longer able to remember it. And so this kind of gets at the idea of how short that short-term or working memory is it's very, very brief, kind of on the time scale of several seconds. Now, some people might be arguing, well, when it comes to like remembering a phone number or anything like that, I can do that as long as I can keep rehearsing that number, and that makes sense with short-term memory. In the case of short-term memory, the span of it's relatively short. However, there's one way that we can really make sure to keep that information steadily in short-term memory, and that's just repeating it. And again, the term here we use is maintenance via rehearsal. But let's say that you get a phone number, if you keep repeating that information over and over again, or if you get a list of words, if you keep repeating that information over and over and over again, then it's going to stay in short-term memory. Now, if you stop saying it, or if you get interrupted in some way, then it's suddenly going to be wiped out of short-term memory. Now, the third part of the modal model is something called long-term memory. And when we talk about long-term memory, we're really kind of talking about a much bigger and a much broader time scale. So for information that's stored in long-term memory, we're talking the time scale of days to infinity. Now, as we all know, their information can be lost out of long-term memory, right? We forget things that happen over time, but then there's other pieces of information, for who knows what reason, stick in memory forever, right? Weird, just benign facts that whenever they come out of your mouth, you're like, why was that in my memory? And that's what we're talking about when we're talking long-term memories. Information that's stored for really long periods of time, and it's available whenever you try to retrieve it to bring it back to short-term memory in order to be able to talk about it. Now, here's where, when I set up earlier that I was going to say that there were several different types of memory, we're going to start kind of dividing things up a little bit. So in the case of long-term memory, we're going to really kind of talk about three different long-term memories. And the first one is something called episodic memory. In the case of episodic memory, where this comes from is you can think of it as like an episode of your life, right? Or if you think about an episode of TV, say Friends or something like that, you can go back and remember exactly what it is that happened in that particular episode. In the case of episodic memory, it's the same thing for life. So for example, if I ask you to think back to prom or high school graduation or a wedding or some other memorable experience in your life, one of the things that you can do is you can almost travel back to that exact moment in time and kind of replay that like an episode of a TV show. You can remember, the different smells that were, or potentially the different smells that were present, or you can remember the exact order of different things. And so when we talk about those types of memories, we call them episodic memories. And these are really kind of memories for particular experiences. Now, this contrasts a lot with something that we call semantic memory. In the case of semantic memory, this is basically just memories for facts. So if I ask you who the first president of the United States was, or if I ask you who was the president during the Civil War, right? These aren't things that you actually experienced in your life, but you just know this information. So a big divide here between episodic and semantic memory is that in episodic memory, you're actually kind of recalling when it is that you learned that particular thing. Whereas in the case of semantic memory, a lot of times you can't. For example, you probably can't recall when was it that you learned that George Washington was the first president of the United States, or that Abraham Lincoln was the president during the Civil War. These are just pieces of information, facts, that are in your memory, and you don't really kind of have some episodic experience of when you've learned them. It's just facts that you know. The third type of memory that we're going to be talking about is called procedural memory. And we've already talked in the class a fair amount about procedural memory, but this is really kind of memory for things like muscle coordination, so how to do things, such as riding a bike or playing musical instrument. Now, one of the things that comes up with procedural memories, or to use a slightly different term that we've used before, implicit memories, these are really memories that are in there and we know how to do them, but we have a hard time verbalizing them. So if you think about teaching a child to ride a bike, we know how to do it, but it's really hard to put into words exactly what it is that's required, talking about things like balance and counter steering the handlebars to the opposite direction that you're leaning, and all of those things. We just know how to do it, and it's very difficult to, if not impossible, to verbally express. And so those are what we refer to as procedural memories. A lot of times procedural memories, when we're trying to teach somebody, it's like, I don't know, you just do it. Where you can't kind of spell out the specific steps for them. So those are the three different types of long-term memory that we're going to be talking about in this unit: episodic memory, or memory about specific episodes in our life or potentially other people's lives, where we can really remember those experiences. Semantic memories, which are just going to be memories about very specific facts, and then procedural memories, which are these implicit, we can't really verbalize them type memories, where we know how to do things, but we just can't explain verbally how it's done. So that's the case with long-term memory. Now here, I just have kind of an example of how each of these play through, right? And so this is just a real life example of the individual stages that we've already talked about so far. So let's assume, I'll just call our friend here Sally. Let's say that Sally's trying to get the phone number to order some sort of a pizza. And so as she goes onto the web to look for the phone number for the pizza shop, basically that information that's hitting her, it's going to be entering sensory memory, right? And so we can even think of Sally closing her eyes and briefly seeing for a very short period of time what the image was that and how it looked on the computer screen. And because she really wants to get that pizza, what she's going to do is find that phone number, and she's going to store it in short-term memory. And not only is she going to store it in short-term memory, but she's also going to rehearse that information over and over again, just repeating the phone number. 555, blah, 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 blah. 555, blah, 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 until she gets to a phone. And she's going to continue doing that until she can get that number out. And once she gets that number out, then usually what happens is that number completely gets wiped out of short-term memory, right? It's removed once she's dialed the phone number and the phone call is going through. Now, to kind of highlight this interaction between short-term memory and long-term memory, one of the things is, let's say Sally is like any college student and relies on pizza for a lot of her meals. She may say, you know, it's kind of a pain to look up the phone number over and over again and go to the website. Maybe I should just sit around and memorize that phone number. And so in that case, what she might do is just sit and try to figure out different ways so that she can memorize that phone number. So the next time she wants pizza, she knows how to automatically get a hold of the pizza shop. And so in that case, she'd be transferring things from short-term memory to long-term memory. Now, the key thing is once it's in long-term memory, once she has that number learned, what's going to happen is whenever she decides, ooh, I want some pizza, she's going to retrieve that information from long-term memory, and it's going to go into short-term memory very, very briefly while she dials that phone number. So here, the kind of walk away is hopefully that step kind of put things into a real life perspective. But the other thing that I really kind of want people to start thinking about is this transition from short-term to long-term memory. So what does it mean to have something in short-term memory? What does it mean to actually store it in the long-term memory? But then also remembering the fact that anytime that we're recalling that information, we're actually going to be pulling it out of long-term memory and putting it into short-term memory. Okay, so as far as a process, and then once we're done with that, once we've ordered or made the phone call to order the pizza, right, that's going to leave short-term memory and go back into long-term memory, presumably. I want people to just kind of get comfortable with moving around how that modal model works, because we're going to keep coming back to some of these ideas as we go throughout this particular chapter and this particular section and kind of talk about how some of the different stages of the modal model might interact with each other. So, per usual, if you have any questions or anything like that, please let me know, because that is something that I want to make really, really clear to you. Now, I should say that while the modal model is kind of the most best known model of memory, and in fact you will see it all over the place. I've recently been to talks doctors are giving, and they're still talking about their ideas in reference to kind of the modal model. And by and large, it was a really, really good model that was put forth. However, there have been some changes to it as time's gone on. And this kind of exemplifies science, right? So we develop some sort of a theory, we find some information that conflicts with that theory, and it's not like we completely throw the theory out, right? We throw it out with the bathwater. Instead, one of the things that we can do is, if it still holds for the most part, and maybe just doesn't perfectly explain everything, we can kind of tweak that theory. And that's really kind of what we've done with modal model. And so a few of the tweaks that have happened over time is when I introduced the kind of original model, I spent a fair amount of time talking about sensory memory. And when this model was introduced, this was a really kind of big, important part of the model. And one of the things that we've come to learn is sensory memory really isn't as important as we originally thought. Yes, it's present, but kind of in the early days of testing this model, a lot of time was spent on sensory memory. And basically what we come to learn is that sensory memory isn't as important as we originally thought. The other big change that's happened, and I've already kind of alluded to this, is that in the original model, they like to think of this kind of in-between stage, this really transient stage of memory as what they called short-term memory. And there's been a shift kind of broadly within the cognitive psychology world to actually take this idea, which is a good idea, and just kind of change the wording on it to working memory. And we'll talk about why this kind of the history of this transition and why it happens. But basically the rough idea here is that what people realized is it wasn't like we were just kind of storing that memory. It wasn't like a dock where we just put things that were going into the warehouse for a short period of time before they got there. But really what we're doing whenever we have something in short-term or working memory is we are really kind of working with that information, right? We're actively playing with it, if you will. So it's not like putting something on a dock, letting it sit there until we can get to it. Instead, it's something that we're actually mentally working with. And so we'll go into that in more detail later. But I just want to highlight that really kind of the current view of it is the term working memory as opposed to short-term memory. Now, I will say that the book does continue to use short-term memory. However, this is something that is pretty rare. Most people actually use the term working memory now, and that's kind of the current label that people put on this basic idea that we're talking about. And I've actually kind of already talked about the issue of working memory and why we made that switch to working memory. But really it's kind of more of a status, as we'll talk about, a memory as opposed to like a specific physical place. And again, we'll go into all of this later, but I really just kind of wanted to make you aware of those big changes that have happened to the modal model over time. And also kind of highlight the fact that this model not only does a great job of introducing what information processing is, but it also does a really nice job of kind of highlighting how theories work in cognitive science, where if we find one thing that's wrong with it, we don't completely scrap the theory, but actually just kind of modify it so that it works better with what our tests of the real world actually look like. So hopefully that helps, and hopefully the modal model is clear to you. Per usual, if you have any questions or anything like that, definitely feel free to reach out to me and ask. I'm happy to answer questions.